Hello everybody, Ketshi1383 with Ketshi Gaming. So I wanted to do a review of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening on the Switch. In which case, I really don't have that much time to do a full-fledged review, and I tend to make them long-winded, so I'm going to try something different and make it a little on the short side. See if I can get this in less than 20 minutes. So, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening on the Switch is a remake of maybe even kind of another remake of the original game on the Game Boy, released in 1993. And like I said, it kind of got remade sort of in 1998 with Link's Awakening DX, which added color and an additional dungeon. So this game was released after A Link to the Past and does share some of the similar gameplay elements to it. As in, when I say after, I mean the Game Boy version, not the Switch version, obviously. But some of those elements are still carried over into the Switch version. So it uses the isometric view that Zelda has been using for quite a while now. At least when it comes to their sort of 2D games. Or in the case of A Link Between Worlds, 2.5D. So with the Switch, they are no longer limited to the hardware of the Game Boy, the little handheld system that could. So with that freedom, they chose to go with a different art style instead of maybe trying to duplicate that of A Link to the Past or A Link Between Worlds. They chose a totally different aesthetic, sort of giving it a sort of, I want to say, plastic kind of toy appearance, which makes a little bit of sense since it was inspired by dioramas. One thing I definitely noticed is that a lot of these characters have very similar resemblance to those that you might see in later games, particularly Ocarina of Time. But that's not the only change that you have in the game. And the visuals aren't the only changes that you will have in this game. Mainly due to the Game Boy's limitations with the number of buttons it had. You know, the D-pad, the start select, and the two A and B buttons. You now have the 4 shoulder buttons, A, B, X, Y, a whole bunch of other ones. 2 analog sticks and a D-pad. They were able to make things a little bit smoother in terms of actual gameplay. Like assigning the shield to one of the shoulder buttons versus having to equip it and use it with the A or the B. And the same goes for the sword as well. They each have their own dedicated button. Now the only thing I think they probably could have done is they actually had more buttons than they probably knew what to do with. And when it comes to cycling through the items, it kind of actually became glaringly obvious when I was playing this game and some other of the older 2D games that I was hitting the start button way too often to switch between items. Or gear, whatever you want to call it. You know, you slow down the game by having to hit the start button, select it, and assign it to whatever button you want it to be assigned to. I mean, both the R, Z, and the R shoulder button raise the shield. I feel like they could have designated one of those to switch between items in, let's say, the X button, and had one of the L shoulders or the LZ switch between items in the Y button. I mean, that's just what I think probably would actually make this game better and probably improve the flow of it. That way I'm not hitting the start button as much as I would usually be. They kind of did that with Breath of the Wild. Yes, you could do that with swords, bows, and shields. You still had to pause the game to eat food or change armor in that game. But still, it feels like a step in the right direction in terms of stopping the starting and pausing and slowing down the gameplay. So I did play a little bit of the DX version since that's the only one I could get my hands on. and I had it a long time ago when it was released on the DS, or 3DS in this case. And I would have to say, in terms of difficulty, the DX version actually feels a little bit harder. And I remember playing through this game when I was streaming it, preparing for this review. It felt really, really easy. I mean, I may have come close once or twice, and the only time I died was doing the famous stealing from the shop bit. And that was it. I never really felt threatened by any of the enemies and or bosses in this game. Now, being easy isn't necessarily a bad thing. I was having fun and I was being entertained, which is what matters most when I play games, personally. Doesn't mean I don't enjoy challenging games. I mean, I played Elden Ring for Pete's sakes. And I'm not sure if the difficulty was due to them trying to get the largest audience they could possibly get, knowing that maybe this sort of toy aesthetic appealed to younger audiences, introducing them to The Legend of Zelda in some shape or form. I suppose that's a possibility. I would have to ask or look it up, but I don't even know where to begin to even start to even get that information, or even who to ask, or even if they would even give me the time of day to even give an answer to those questions if I were to ask them. But in terms of overall gameplay, the game is pretty smooth. There's zero lag of any kind in terms of its frame rate. It does feel a little on the slow side, I'll admit that, which probably contributes to the easy part of the game. And I do kind of enjoy the toy-ish kind of look that the game has. Now, one thing I did find kind of irritating was that enemies will drop sort of these items that will enhance your defense or your attack. And it happens a lot, and it just kind of gets a little on the annoying side after a little bit, having to stop and show that you have now picked up this item instead of just picking it up and going with the flow of the game. And in terms of actual overall gameplay, it is kind of a bit of a collectathon. Not quite like in the vein of Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie, but yes, you go around and you can collect the heart pieces and the seashells, which unlocks new items for Link to use. They were in the original Link's Awakening, but they've added more for the Switch version. Same for the heart pieces. And that's mainly due to the size of the screen of the Game Boy kind of put a limit on how many hearts they could fit onto the screen. They kind of remedied that, I shouldn't say they did remedy that by adding more heart pieces to the game. Now, in terms of enemies, it is sort of unique to the Legend of Zelda series in a way. Yes, they all have their own art style, except for maybe one boss that is definitely pretty much a clone of the third dungeon in the Link to the Past. I can't remember it. It's the giant bug thing with a weakness on its tail. It's pretty much the same boss. But what makes this particular Legend of Zelda stand out more than others is that it has enemies from Mario in the game. Yes, as in Goombas, Piranha Plants, Shy Guys, Boos, Bloopers, Cheep Cheep, Buster Beetle, and they even have Chain Chomps. Even though they're not an enemy, you do get to walk one around like a dog, making this probably the most unique Zelda games in terms of enemies Link has fought. I mean, he shows Mario how it's done. He's like, I just cut him, Mario. What are you doing? This puts Link's Awakening on the Switch, and I guess also on the Game Boy and the Link's Awakening DX as one of the more unique Zelda games in terms of its enemies. So now let's talk about the dungeons. The dungeons in this game are actually pretty simple for the most part. And like I said already, the gameplay isn't difficult by any means. And the dungeons are no different. Most of them can be done in an hour if you're kind of messing around. You could probably do them faster, especially if you know the layout. And like I said before, they definitely recycled some bosses from A Link to the Past. And they're kind of your usual Zelda fare, with most of them just containing one floor with maybe some ladders where you encounter most of the Nintendo villains. There is one dungeon where you do have to consider what floor you're on, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. Now, speaking of the dungeons, they did bring a additional character into the Switch version, Dampé. He runs more or less the side of the game that they did add, which is you can more or less create your own dungeons. And they do have preset patterns, which you can see on the screen right there. And to be honest, you do need them to get 100%, as in to get all the hearts. You don't have to complete all of them, but you need to do some of them to get all the hearts, all the jars and stuff like that. Now, I think the second or third time I played through, I completed all of them. Every single last dungeon. It wasn't particularly enjoyable arranging these things on the larger maps. Mainly due to limitations that they put on some of them. Others were just really large, and I had to use every single last piece, or almost every single last piece, just to get the map to work. If they kept it small, it would have been far more enjoyable, and I know some people were talking about kind of like a Zelda builder, like what they did with Mario, except obviously with Zelda. And it obviously didn't come to fruition, or at least hasn't yet. And they gave reasons for it, sort of, in terms of designing a Zelda level is not the same as designing a Mario level. But for me, I guess the most frustrating part, especially when you get to maps where they make you connect different parts of the map using stairwells, is you can't tell it what stairwell you want it to connect to. It does it automatically. So I'd waste 10, 15 minutes on this map just trying to get the stairwells to connect in some shape or form that'll satisfy the conditions, and it just was not enjoyable, which is probably the biggest downfall to the maps or the dungeon creator. And I guess something that's only a bit of a negative is the lack of coherency amongst the pieces, because you could just take any tile that they give you and put them together, and most of these tiles, or actually I should say all of them, come from the various dungeons that you encounter in the game. So you get tiles that just don't mix and match all that well. Otherwise, it's kind of entertaining. It gets a little tedious, like I said, when putting together the larger dungeons. I suppose there could be a possible future for a Zelda dungeon builder. Maybe. I don't know. Now, let's finish with the story. And I'm going to give a spoiler, because I don't know if I could talk about this without spoiling the story. What little there is in a Zelda game. This probably has more story than some of the others, particularly the first two. So it starts off with that really amazing cutscene at the beginning that's well animated of Link on a boat and it's sinking, and he wakes up on an island, which is usual Zelda fare at this point, is for Link to wake up, and he finds out he's on Koholint Island. I really hope I pronounced that right. And he's being directed to find 8 instruments to wake up the windfish. And in order to collect these instruments, you have to defeat nightmares in each dungeon, which kind of alludes to some aspect of the story. With one of them actually saying that if you wake up the windfish, everyone on the island will be destroyed. Coming to find that, yes, in a sort of way that is true, and you sort of have to wonder if that includes Link if he were to awaken the windfish. And there's even a little bit of a moment with Marin sort of wondering what was out there, not knowing that she is part of a dream. And it sort of almost makes you think that you're going to have some weird existential crisis in that, do I dare wake up the windfish? What happens if I do? Do I die as well? I mean, you really don't have much of a choice. The game doesn't continue if you don't. It's right on the edge of actually sort of being philosophical, but not quite. Due to the very nature of you completing the game, it's not like there's a choice in the matter. I guess you could just turn it off, but that's not really much of a choice now, is it? So after collecting all the instruments, Link heads to the giant egg in the middle of the island, and he cracks it open and goes inside, and he defeats the last nightmare, which takes on multiple forms. And you do get to see the windfish. But before you do, he does confirm that this is a dream, and it's his dream, and that everything will come to an end. And there's a cutscene that plays with it. And it shows everybody that you've interacted, well, not everybody, but it shows a good deal of the characters that you've interacted with disappear in a flash. And it's not unsettling, but it's definitely kind of on the dark side, in my opinion, considering that most of these people definitely had personalities, and you really couldn't tell that this was a dream until they told you it was, and you just see everything disappear. And you get to see another cutscene that's animated. I like it. I really like the actual animations that they had at the end and beginning of the game. And you hear Marin singing, and the windfish fly over. I'm not entirely sure why they call it a windfish. It's more like a whale. I'm not sure if that's like a translation thing or not. But I do think that this whale windfish is actually a similar, if not the same, character from Skyward Sword that you meet in that game. I don't know, that's just a little side tidbit. So, overall, this game was definitely entertaining, and I did enjoy playing myself for the most part. With probably the only really boring, tedious parts were actually the dungeon creator, and mainly the last few maps that you had to do, or any maps that required you to try and link any staircases together. And honestly, this game actually sort of set precedent for a lot of things to come into the Legend of Zelda series. This was the first game that Link could jump in, or at least as far as the isometric Zeldas are concerned, it's the first one he can jump in. He also fished in this game. And I know they're releasing the DX version on their online service, but I'd honestly say play this one over that. So, if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching and have a good one.